alarms off. Positive vibrations on that? Yeah.
Center panel.
Welcome, everybody. Is the mic working? All right. Welcome to our session on market opportunities in Europe. We have a highly experienced panel here with lots of interesting issues to discuss. So first, I'd like to introduce the panel to you. What we do, I'm Pat Foodie. I'm with Iogen. We are a longtime technology developer in the renewable fuels space. We developed the world's only successful cellulosic ethanol process, and we have developed a technology for using RNG in refineries to make gasoline and diesel. We practice that today. We're a buyer of RNG, and the RNG is converted into fuels, put on ships, and sent to Europe. So I personally have a lot of experience with the European compliance market, and that is my story. Patrick, introduce yourself.
Hi, thanks, Pat. My name's Patrick Lynch. I'm the CEO of a company called BioLedger. We're a software developer based in London, and our objective is to help companies demonstrate compliance with the European and other sustainability compliance requirements, particularly the European Union database, which is a new mandatory requirement to record all biofuel transactions on a centralized database. And I've 15 years experience in the biofuel supply chain, buying and building diverse feedstock and biofuel supply chains for a company in the UK.
Siva?
Yes, good morning again, and good to be back talking about low carbon fuels and opportunities. So, my name is Siva Aripati. I work for ExxonMobil in the low carbon business. This is a relatively new business, and part of my role is trying to find ways to lower the cost of low carbon fuels, and also think about scale, so that, because the industry we are dealing with is vast, right? I mean, we need solutions that are scalable and more affordable. So that's kind of what we are exploring.
Hi, good morning. Jeffrey Wright, VP of Project Development at Oberon Fuels. Oberon is a U.S. company based in San Diego, and we develop and market multiple renewable fuels, primarily focused at the moment at renewable methanol or biomethanol, renewable dimethyl ether or DME, and soon renewable hydrogen. But we're also developing some RNG projects as well. We're here because we think about the different feedstocks that we utilize in making these fuels. There's different kind of entry points, but raw biogas is one of those feedstocks that we use. So as opposed to cleaning up that gas and getting it to market, however you do, we take that raw biogas and put it through our process to make renewable fuels. So we're actively looking at developing these fuels now, projects in development, and some of these fuels are already contracted to go to different European markets.
Good morning. My name is Cynthia Walker. I'm the CEO of Mobius Fuels, and we are a landfill gas to RNG developer and owner and operator. And I think my interest here, based on my background, decades in traditional oil and gas, my interest is really about taking RNG to the next level, bringing in new sources of capital to the industry that have a more attractive cost of capital, and in turn finding much bigger markets. And so expanding our markets beyond the US and finding those low carbon fuel markets in Europe and Asia. So thank you for having me.
And I'll just add that Cynthia was a leader in a company called TESS, which was involved in developing e-methane markets and has a lot of global experience on the sort of emergent demand for these fuels. And I think she finds the biomethane business, as we call it in Europe, to be an interesting stepping stone. So I thought I'd start. We have a lot of issues, regulatory and opportunities in the market, but I thought I'd first provide a few slides and background on the European markets. Not everybody knows about these markets, so I'm going to give a little market primer, and then we're going to talk about the key issues that we see in the market. So the first thing is that in Europe, there's legislated requirements for renewable fuels. There are three basic segments that are sort of most interesting to biomethane. One is road transport. This is vehicles, trucks, cars, and that has evolved from more than 15 years of legislation through RED I and then RED II and then RED III. And then when the Ukraine crisis happened, they enacted an acceleration of the decarbonization of the economy in Europe. They developed something they called the Fit for 55 program, and they want to achieve a 55% reduction of carbon intensity in the European market by 2030. And what that led to was an expansion to the marine market and the aviation market. And they have two more programs. So there's basically three programs: road transport, marine transport, and aviation. The road transport, they all have increasing targets, and they're all somewhat different. The road transport market is well established. they have increased their target to 14.5% greenhouse gas reduction by 2030. And there's other compliance methods. Countries can comply by using a fraction of renewable fuels as well. They also have a separate category called advanced biofuels, which are fuels from waste, and mostly biogas fits into that category. They have premium value, and there's a special annex to feedstocks that give waste-based fuels sort of special increased value in the marketplace. In the marine side, it's pure greenhouse gas emissions. It's feedstock agnostic. There's an increasing rate of greenhouse gas emissions over time, and it requires anybody who's shipping into Europe to have to acquire these fuels. And in aviation, they also have increasing targets. They only permit waste feedstocks, and I think for all of these fuels, there's some opportunities of direct use. Direct use in road transport of biomethane can be through CNG or LNG trucks, or it can be in marine and bio-LNG. But it also, biomethane can be a feedstock to make all kinds of different fuels. It's an interesting feedstock. It can make biomethane. It can be used to make biomethanol, biodiesel, or biohydrogen-based fuels. We use a refinery pathway and make gasoline and diesel. All of those can serve these markets. I think the aviation market has sort of special requirements that give sort of unique opportunities. There is a pathway for going from biomethane to methanol, through methanol to jet. There's also a pathway that involves a gas to liquids technology called Fischer-Tropsch, which would also be a viable pathway. So these are evolving. The targets are sort of 2030 based. There's increasing targets in marine and aviation over time. And I wanted to say a little bit about the scale of these markets. I've kind of documented here what the size of the base use of fuels is and the percent reductions. And what you can get from this slide is that the market size of road transport is about 30 million tons of oil equivalent. Biomethane used in transport in Europe, European biomethane is about 1 million tons of oil equivalent. There's a lot of market there. And these new markets, marine and aviation, are sort of in the 1 to 2 million tons of oil equivalent. So they're about the scale of what is used today in the biomethane in transport in the EU. Just a little bit about the EU market. The production of biomethane in the EU is about 4 times bigger than the US, although much of it is not in transport. It's just used as a decarbonizer in the grid. I wanted to say a little bit about the IMO regulation that is emergent. And I think what people should take is that it's a very large new market. If you compare the bottom left-hand box with the bottom right-hand box, you can see that the targets for IMO, which is a global target, is going to lead to a very significant new demand for fuels. So compare it to the Marine EU, 1.5 million tons in 2030. This is like 26 million tons globally, which is really significant on the biofuel scale. And I think that this is going to drive a lot of change in the biofuel markets altogether, and it's going to create opportunities for biogas-derived fuels. One thing about this particular market is they have a buyout. It's a very aggressive, like 30% reduction by 2035. They have and there's a whole bunch of complication about tiers, but the really significant bite is a $380 a ton buyout price. So for those ships that can't meet the targets, they're facing this buyout price. It probably won't happen in the beginning, but I think over time, it could really be the global price signal for these biofuels. And I wanted to put that in context a bit. This is a 5-year history of the implied price of carbon reduction in the European market. And what you can see in the blue lines here are 2 different types of biodiesel. The red line is renewable diesel, HVO as they call it. And what it shows is that the implied price of carbon varies a lot. And you can see on here the $380 target price. The biofuels today, the biomass-based diesel fuels are lower cost. And I think you should expect them to be drawn into the market and be really the price setter in the market. So when you think of this, you shouldn't necessarily be thinking of the bio price. You should be thinking of the biodiesel spread, which is kind of like a D4 RIN in the US. So if you think of a D4 RIN being the global price setting, that would be a good way to think about how the value is set. I wanted to explain how compliance is demonstrated. The compliance system is a supply chain moderated system where every party in the supply chain must be certified. So right back to the original feedstock, every participant gets certified. And the most common certifier would be ISCC. This is a slide from ISCC. Every party along the way gets a certificate, and the premise is that if every party along the way gets a valid certificate, then when it shows up at the end point, then it'll be compliant. There has been some history of fraud or alleged fraud, and the European government is implementing something they call the UDB, the Union Database for Biofuels, and it's a database that will track all transactions right from the point of origin through all the supply chain. And I think it's a significant enhancement to the compliance framework. I think it really helps prevent fraud, and I think it's going to have implications on the tracking of biomethane in pipelines, which we'll talk about. The last thing I wanted to mention was about the terminology we use. I hear a lot of people here use the term book and claim to generally describe the practice of transfers in the biogas systems. And I'd like to encourage you to expunge that term from your vocabulary and to use the term mass balance. And the reason for that is that book and claim is illegal in Europe. So if you tell somebody I'm using a book and claim system, it invalidates your eligibility. So when we go to regulators and say, oh, in America we have the same book and claim system, that undermines confidence by the European regulators. And I wanted to explain the difference between a mass balance system and a book and claim system. And it's, there's a lot of nuance to it, but at a high level, it's really about how the commodity is transacted. The commodity in a mass balance system is the physical fuel itself. And the physical fuel has intrinsic attributes for which there are certificates that come with the physical trade, and all trades are moderated physically. Whereas in a book and claim system, you generate a certificate upon origination of the fuel or of the instrument, and that is a financial instrument which can be traded on a registry. A RIN is a form of book and claim instrument, but it's a compliance method that happens after compliance. For all of the supply chains we work with, we need to use physical trade. And while there are proof of sustainabilities, they're not independently tradable certificates. And I think that when you use this term, you should, we don't actually practice book and claim in North America because the trades are all moderated. The EPA doesn't allow book and claim. Maybe some of the tax regimes will. But I think that if you're looking to establish portability of your product, you should be referring to mass balance as your way of doing things. So with that background, I would like to start on the UDB. I'll give a little background here. More than a year ago, the European Commission announced that they would be implementing the UDB for gaseous fuels, and they had a bunch of requirements which created a stir in the industry and threatened to make North American supply through the grid ineligible for European compliance. So with us here is Patrick Lynch. He's one of the world's foremost experts in the UDB. And Patrick, tell us about the problem, the background. You're doing a lot of work in liquids and liquid fuels. Tell us about the UDB and what's the current state of it?
Yeah, thanks, Pat. The UDB is a centralized database that will record all transactions from the point of origin where the sustainability impact happens to the point of consumption where the incentive is awarded to the sustainable molecules and the supplier of them. In the European system, you have very differentiated requirements based on those sustainability impacts. So all of the molecules supplied into the European markets, 27 different markets, have to demonstrate compliance with the minimum sustainability criteria. So that you have to prove that there's no deforestation, that there are mandatory social criteria applied, and that carbon emissions on a life cycle basis are calculated correctly. In addition to that minimum standard, each of the 27 member states creates a market that either caps the quantity supplied from, say, crop-based biofuels, or applies additional incentives to things that they consider more sustainable, like the Annex 9 list that Pat mentioned, which are waste-based raw materials, whether it's used cooking oil or fish processing residues, manure. Those will receive higher premiums in 27 different markets. So the systems that we built as a group of stakeholders over the last 15 years is based on certification of each node in the supply chain and transfer of those sustainability attributes through the supply chain on pieces of paper, which are audited on an annual basis by an independent auditor. I wrote some of those requirements in 2011, and we used them across the world to buy Brazilian sugarcane ethanol, to buy Chinese HVO from used cooking oil. And in 2019, there was a major failure where 32% of the biofuels supplied into the Netherlands were found to have been counterfeited using those same systems. So certified suppliers supplied used cooking oil, biodiesel, certified proof of sustainability, whereas the real biofuel was palm, probably deforested, certainly a lower value. And the whole stakeholder group was basically brought into a room by the regulators and told, you need to improve traceability and demonstrate full compliance, or the incentives would be removed. And the solution was to remove those tens of millions of pieces of paper that move through the supply chain and replace it with a digital system that prohibits any creation of fraudulent claims through the supply chain. And for the last 5 years, the European Commission has been building this database and trying to make sure that every type of operator in the supply chain, whether it's a HVO producer in the US or a sugarcane plantation operator in Brazil, is able to submit their information into this database in a way that's easy and compliant. And yeah, we've been working with stakeholders to design and test and build that system over the last 5 years. And with that centralized database, it gives the European regulators real-time data and observability of all of the transactions through the supply chain, and the ability to investigate immediately and suspend operators and claims in that system. And that would be a much improved system than everyone in the supply chain operating with concern that the next fraud event will touch their book. And that has been the case. It's been emotional and disruptive in the supply chain. So it's a big improvement.
So, Patrick, you're involved in the supply chain and the control of liquids. What is the status? Is it working on liquids? And what are they saying they're going to do with biomethane?
Yeah, the scope of the database is supposed to record the sustainable consignments from the point of origin until the point of consumption and all of the transactions and processes in between. It has been operational since 15th of January 24. We've been working with the European Waste Biodiesel Association, 45 biodiesel producers and companies like Chevron, REG, Trafigura, Greenergy. Those companies are already actively using the database in the testing environment. There's been a lot of ambiguity on the mandatory deadlines for compliance, so everyone is held off in terms of reporting and implementing that on the liquid road fuel supply chain. And we now have this weird crossover where gaseous fuels, although they were sort of the second stage of development of this union database, have actually fast-tracked themselves into the liquid fuel market and the UDB problem by some of the pathways that Pat mentioned earlier.
Yeah, these frauds have occurred because basically parties have been able to create biofuels out of nothing. And when you track from the origin through to the end, you can avoid that. And in the pipeline system, they're trying to avoid the situation where you inject once and claim twice. And that's the core. And they're trying to do it through the information from the pipeline systems. And the European pipeline system is more under the control of the European government. And they've said, we're going to get the European pipeline registrations working first, and then we're going to talk about third countries. And in the meantime, third countries won't be allowed to supply. That's what they've said. Jeffrey, Cynthia, you've been in the market. Tell us about what buyers are saying about the impact of this, the advent of the UDB, and what does it mean for trade?
Well, I think the one big piece that jumps out, for cross-border trade, other than tariffs, would be that when you have uncertainty around how you comply, things freeze. And so it's very difficult to get parties, committed to be willing to do long-term offtake that's not subject to a change in law. So for us as a developer, that becomes challenging. However, I do think it's important to do what we can, as producers, to continue to move molecules that direction. And you can do that today in a couple of ways. One is through products, as Pat described, that Iogen is involved in, products that are produced in the US and have a much clearer mechanism to move to Europe and feed into mandate markets. And that can be on liquid fuels, but the other big program that Europe is putting in place is CBAM, and effectively putting a carbon price onto products that are imported. So if there are products, steel will be near-term, chemicals down the line, as you utilize a decarbonized feedstock to produce here in the US and export to Europe, there should be a benefit to that manufacturer. So those are a couple of ways that molecules can move today while there's uncertainty around the UDB. And then the voluntary market. There are definitely cargoes of biogas that are moving as attachments to LNG cargoes, and being utilized in the market in Europe on a voluntary basis. Obviously, some of these markets that we're talking about are a lot deeper, and maybe a higher and better use for those of us on the production side. But there are ways to move today, and I think as an industry, we need to be willing to help support these markets as they get going. So.
Yeah, I would certainly, mirror those comments. I think that, we've got a slightly unique situation that, our experience trying to get some products to Europe has been twofold. One has been around biomethanol, and being that we produce our fuels on site from raw biogas, we're not really, we don't have the issue about, trying to mass balance or, heaven forbid, book and claim that RNG into our system. That said, we do supplement our biogas with additional RNG to get that right ratio of hydrogen and carbon that we need. That mass balance has given a little bit of people kind of cause for pause in wanting to really kind of contract, that fuel. I think that, the other issue that we've really came up against was kind of less about the UDB issue. It was more on pricing of specifically around biomethanol, in that, we're working directly with the shippers. They were really trying to kind of squeeze price down to prices that were coming out of China, which was, not sustainable on a lot of levels. So, we've had more success working directly with, global fuel traders, who, are willing to take a long-term position in some of these fuels as it fits into their energy transition strategy, and being able to contract for large volumes, 10-year contracts for, products made, in a specific methodology to get into particular markets, whether it's Europe, whether it's domestic. That said, we've also, developed or developing an RNG project from a unique feedstock. Both of these projects are from poultry. And, the challenge is we're not getting that product to California, and that's fine, but it's, the real challenge for, I guess, all of us who are developing, CI driven or CI focused RNG projects is how to monetize that CI. So, there are some, that will evolve, we hope, especially with the IMO, whether they're going to monetize, negative CIs in any of the fuels that are going to go into their ships, whether it's LNG or, renewable LNG, methanol, ammonia or whatever. But we've found a fuel trader who was back-to-backing, our RNG supply with somebody who was using that RNG as a feedstock for another fuel, and was taking a risk position on this RNG, in that they'd be able to get it directly into market. And I think the view was, once the UDB becomes resolved, that might be a bit of a, hopefully for all of us, a bit of a land rush for more fuel going to the market. They want to kind of lock in kind of a known price and a known CI now. So, it continues to evolve. We don't really know where it's going. We're all, as optimistic as we can be that we'll be able to get these fuels, to market. And, and it's opening up, right? Whether it's, methanol as a feedstock to, you can go to RNG to methanol to SAF, to gasoline, methanol is a feedstock to domestic biofuels as well. So those are opening up, and we're pretty optimistic, for our industry and for the RNG industry in general that that these methane molecules will get into future uses, and in our view and hope is those are in liquid form.
I'm going to skip you, Siva, as we try to manage the schedule here. But a lot of people ask me what's going to happen, when is this going to bite? And I think the summary of it is that by the end of the year, we should have a view on where the European Commission is headed, and probably in 2 years, there'll be some type of bite on it. Patrick and I are very involved deep in the European policy side. And just this morning, you got schedule indications. So why don't you tell us the sort of details of how the schedules are going to go forward?
Yeah, I've lived through or survived 3 failed deadlines for UDB implementation, and normally they were those previous deadlines failed because the supply chain wasn't ready to demonstrate compliance, and they expressed that, and there were improvements to the functionality of the database to help companies get on board in the last 18 months or so. This morning we saw a leaked document that set out a roadmap for final version of the deadline, which would be basically implementing legislation by May 25. The governments then have to write that legislation into national legislation 27 times. And then they should standardize on a January 26 implementation timeline. That has to be confirmed by the European Commission in a meeting on the 12th of May. But those are the kind of provisional deadlines that they're currently working toward.
And those would be deadlines for liquid biofuels. The biomethane protocols aren't yet developed. So there's other legislation that's coming. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think it's probably oversight in the design that the Commission did not know that US RNG would make its way into the European market as liquid molecules, but the Union database requires that European pipeline operators verify the quantity injected into the grid and withdrawn from the grid on European gaseous fuels. They also make that requirement for non-European supply chains, but don't provide the technical pathway to allow it. So from the European perspective, there will be another piece of implementing legislation by the end of this year that makes it mandatory for European pipeline operators to log in and verify injections and withdrawals. And that will also hopefully give some flexibility for how non-European supply chains can perform that role. So how does a US pipeline operator verify an injection or withdrawal? Our suggestion is that they call on independent certification bodies to verify that data on a voluntary basis.
Great. So I'm going to shift gears now, and I'm just going to shift slides as well and talk about the IMO. The IMO market is really interesting, and it's going to, if it gets adopted, have a really big impact. And in fact, the way the markets resolve, any country where there's dual credits permitted is probably going to be the lowest cost compliance effort. So you could expect that in the European maritime, where there's credits available under one program, if you're available under one program, you'll be able to subsidize your credit on another program. So I think this crosses over into the European market, although it's way, way, way larger. So I'd like to call on you, Siva. What's the likelihood of final adoption of this requirement?
Yeah, so thanks, Pat. I knew you were going to ask this question. But I think for context, I would say that the IMO policy, which is a greenhouse gas reduction policy, is probably one of the most transformative policies in shipping that we've seen in a long time, right? And it is life cycle based with interim targets for reducing carbon intensity. And there are checkpoints in 2030 and 2040 to make sure the appropriate limits, even the $380 that Pat showed, that number can change over time. And really, IMO is targeting net zero around 2050. They don't want 2050 exactly, but around 2050. That's what they're saying. So in terms of how legitimate this is, I would just say that IMO, we have trust in IMO and their ability to deliver on policies like this. We've seen that happen on the sulfur space. So I think they're well positioned to do the same. And there's a key meeting in October. That's when hopefully this will pass.
Yeah, and from what I gather from people, it's over the hump. The difficult part is done, and now it's finishing. It's not just a proposal for consultation. It's much closer to adoption. So Cynthia, Jeffrey, in owning, developing projects, if the IMO comes along and the verification schemes are become robust and set up, what is that going to mean for the RNG business, or fuels made from RNG as well?
Yeah, well, I think it's a huge positive. Clearly, if you look at the backlogs of new ships that are being built, the most alternative fuel ships are LNG-based ships. So for those of us that produce RNG, it's obviously a very easy direct swap into an LNG fueled ship. So that's really positive. I think one of the things that we need to see, particularly in the US and other places across the world, other big bunkering centers in Europe and in Asia around Singapore, is just more LNG bunkering infrastructure getting built. There are a number of projects along the Gulf Coast that are underway, and I hope, this movement towards decarbonization of marine shipping is going to be a catalyst to actually get that infrastructure built, so we can have the proper, tracking of the mass balance.
Yeah, we're not on the LNG side, but on the methanol side, it's virtually identical, right? There are ships on order, there is scant supply under development. A lot of those developers were really kind of waiting to see kind of some traction and vision from the IMO, which we now have. So, that really opens up for, large scale bio or e-methanol in the United States, and, however you get there. That infrastructure is being built, as Cynthia mentioned, not only on the Gulf Coast here, but also in the ports of Europe. So we have some conversations with ports in Portugal, et cetera, where they're already looking to build kind of multi-fuel support at those ports for, molecules, not only, for LNG, for biomethanol, even for DME. So it's really going to open things up, from our perspective.
Yeah, and I would just add to what Cynthia was talking about, LNG and RNG. There's a very good synergy, and as a very large LNG producer ourselves, we're going to be exploring supplying LNG and RNG for shipping very soon. So I think it's an exciting opportunity for RNG producers to be part of that mix. What I will say that after October, there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of clarity on how the life cycle CI is calculated under IMO framework, how the certification is going to work. We had a lot of lengthy discussion on UDB. There's going to be a similar discussion on IMO. So people like Patrick are going to be super busy in figuring out, end of the day, we need super clarity on this as producers, as project developers. What is my CI score according to IMO policy? We need to get to that level of granularity.
Yeah, and there is in the IMO regulation no explicit recognition of the ability to achieve offset credits for methane, no methane credits. So that would be something that would, if it occurs, would need to be added. But I don't think it's all bad news, because these markets all trade together, and if the only place you can get the methane credit is in the transport market, the markets will trade, and I think that it still will be good for the business. I'll switch to Patrick. You've got a lot of experience in the compliance. With the IMO, with a new compliance regime, how do you see compliance being managed, and what do you think the challenges are in getting a robust system that can achieve the objectives? It is worth noting that the flag countries of the ships are going to be responsible. So a ship might be flagged in Libya, and Libya is responsible for implementing this. Patrick, tell us your thoughts on that.
Yeah, the same Marine Environmental Protection Committee that defined and will hopefully confirm the mandate in October also sets the criteria for the greenhouse gas life cycle analysis calculations. And at the moment, the mandate is purely on carbon intensity reduction, with no definition of other sustainability criteria. But there has been a lot of lobbying from environmental and social non-governmental organizations to say that there should be. So there should be some differentiation between waste-based fuels or waste-based supply chains and crop-based that have these other sustainability risks. There's the proposal to, currently the IMO committee has developed a draft life cycle analysis calculation with default values and methodologies. It's different to some of the other, like the Renewable Energy Directive calculations, so we need to consider that in our valuation of the different options and the compliance requirement, but same but different. The objectives are the same, the risks are the same, the solutions will be very similar. That committee will have to develop those with stakeholders over the next year, and they'll be published and voted on. But definitely the life cycle carbon emissions calculations are important. I think they will have to have that debate on whether they differentiate between high-risk biofuel options that have indirect land use change risks like palm and other feedstocks, and either account for that in the carbon calculation or in some of the implementing criteria. And they will also have to propose some certification systems, and there is a proposal that they will benchmark existing certification systems and then approve those as options for compliance. And there will be the risk of fraud, because you'll have value put on sustainable consignments that are based on their life cycle performance. So there will be the same risk of fraud there that will have to be controlled.
And I think what it means as a producer is probably that if you're ISCC certified for the EU system, while the numbers you certify for might not be identical, the framework and the certifications are probably going to be robust enough to give you market optionality. I wanted to shift to another topic of interest to the European markets, and that is the carbon value. One of the unique features of biogas production is that for every mole of methane production, you generally get a mole of CO2, and a lot of people look at recovering and selling CO2 as a product for other people's use. I wanted to point out that under these systems, if you collect the CO2 and you use it, you permanently dispense it in carbon capture, the value you can get would be the value on this chart. So the price point in the transportation market of the value of sequestration is much higher than the merchant price in general. So I think it's worth noting that these markets are going to create additional value for projects that can and do capture CO2 if they can sequester it. And what it's going to do is confer value onto the biomethane product itself. I'll shift to you, Shiva. Can you, or Siva, tell us about ExxonMobil's capabilities in carbon capture and how you see this playing out?
Yeah, so part of the low carbon business that I'm part of, carbon capture and storage is a key aspect because it enables reducing emissions in, I would say, three key areas, which is heavy industry like steel, cement, ammonia plants, etc. And then power generation, that's a big one. A lot of CO2 coming out of that sector. And then the third is commercial transportation, right? That's where we have road vehicles, we have ships and planes. So CCS can enable value for all of these different sectors. And through the Denbury acquisition, we are quite active in this space, where we are looking at a number of opportunities near the infrastructure that we control, roughly 1,500-mile pipeline, long pipeline in the US Gulf Coast. So I would say there is a tremendous opportunity for RNG producers to pair carbon capture, either storage or utilization, both options, depending on the end use of the product and policies that you're after. So I think you should consider CCS as part of the solution. There are some logistical items to be thought through as you develop your project, because scale and proximity to CCS infrastructure is going to be critical to make the economics work.
Cynthia, you're in the business of financing, acquiring projects. Do you look at CCS capability as a value driver in a project?
Well, we absolutely look at CO2 and opportunities to sequester or to utilize it. I, for one, really think it's a meaningful opportunity, probably a bit down the road for many of us in RNG. These markets around CO2 are very local. In certain locations, you're going to have the ability to sequester. In certain locations, you're going to have good markets for utilization. So it's putting those things together. I'd love to see the markets evolve in a way where we can utilize the CO2 actually to produce additional fuels. So Pat mentioned earlier, I have some experience with e-methane or ENG, as some may have heard it. And that's where you take CO2 and you combine it with green hydrogen and make natural gas. So you just have this continuous virtuous cycle of waste going into fuels. And so I think that's a place I'd love to see the opportunity go. It's a little challenged near term around costs. We really need to see not so much the cost of capture, but really the cost of producing that hydrogen come down. So we definitely look at it, and we prefer projects where we have the opportunity to do something with CO2 down the road. It's not something we want to pay for, nor do we think we need to, but it's definitely an opportunity for this market that we're excited about.
I'm just going to keep managing the schedule here, so I'll just go to Patrick on CO2 as a feedstock for a process. If somebody buys CO2, how does the UDB handle that?
Yeah, I don't think the Commission had considered it before, but CO2 gets recorded in the Union database in carbon capture or in the life cycle analysis calculations, and those are passed through the chain. But if it's a feedstock, an input mass to the production process, then it has to be recorded as a sustainable point of origin in the Union database and tracked downstream from there.
And I think when you think of e-fuels like ENG, if CO2 is an input, is the UDB ready for e-fuels?
No, it's definitely not. No.
Have they even proposed anything?
They've approved some certification systems for certification of renewable fuels from non-biological origin, but they have not yet added electricity or CO2 or hydrogen sources and the ability to report those in the Union database yet.
Okay. And so Europe is sort of a benchmark market for this. I just finally wanted to close up on the question of other markets, adjacent markets. We've talked about among us, anywhere that LNG, American LNG goes, American bio-LNG can go and add value. Cynthia, you've looked around the world. Tell us about what you've seen on that front.
Yeah, well, I think one of the other markets that we're really excited about is Asia. Europe has the largest percentage of U.S. imports of LNG, and Asia is number 2, and it's a long-standing partner that has really facilitated investment in LNG in the U.S. and around the globe. It's also a part of the world that is looking for alternatives to decarbonize its various uses of natural gas. One target that has been put out there in Japan is a 2030 target for the domestic utilities in Japan to decarbonize 1% of their natural gas feedstock. They have a number of different ways that they can do that. E-methane is certainly one that's out there, but I think what is going to be a great glide path for Japan and Asia more broadly is to start with RNG and think about some of those other molecules when the environment is right. So definitely all on board. Where LNG goes, RNG goes.
Siva, Exxon's a big LNG marketer, producer. What are your thoughts of LNG and bio-LNG as a sort of a constituent in the cargo?
Yeah, I think, like I said, we are entering the shipping sector from supplying. We are a fuel supplier for the marine sector already. We're going to be looking at bringing LNG and RNG into that portfolio. We have presence in Europe, in Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Antwerp area, as well as in Singapore, which is the largest bunkering hub in the world. So I think those markets will grow. And as Cynthia mentioned, there is a bit of a bottleneck in terms of having bunkering capability for LNG, in terms of availability of infrastructure and so on. Hopefully over time that'll get resolved. So I would say there's a good future for RNG in that market. Another area, our affiliate company is also looking at multiple, I think we have about 12 biofuel projects globally. We are looking at various opportunities. And SAF is one area we're focused on. We are supplying SAF today in France, UK, in Singapore, on a limited basis where there is some policy. So RNG may have an option to get into SAF, either through hydrogen or some other means as well.
Yeah, and a shout out to Exxon's vision of integrating carbon capture into fossil hydrogen production. It's really a building block, but it does require biogenic CO2 to really get to market. And I think that's another value driver in the CO2 area that's of note. So I'll stop there and see if there's any questions. Any questions from the audience?
Pat, of course you hate me, but so here's this thing about Exxon and marine fuel and all that, and I made that point before. What's your perspective on if we really want to get into the marine fuel market? We probably need a gas station on the West Coast, probably in Long Beach or Los Angeles, because otherwise the whole global box shipping is just not happening on LNG. So the question for you is, what's your plan on putting a facility in there? Or should Total do that, or who should be doing that? And the compound question on that one is, how are you going to deal with California that really hates fossil fuels?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the LNG marketing team is looking at various options. If I were to guess, I think we probably initial supply would be likely in Europe and Singapore. And I think you asked the question yesterday as well on California. There are other ways US RNG can make it into shipping for those routes. One example could be methanol, where if IMO allows RNG into a methanol plant, and that could be biomethanol. So that is one interim solution possibly until infrastructure is available in those ports for LNG bunkering. But I would say that markets are very creative. As long as there is demand, there will be opportunities for supply that will follow that.
Anybody else pitch in on that? All right. So I think we've covered it. Thank you very much for attending, everybody. Oh, there's one more question. Go ahead.
Sorry. So you spoke earlier about mass balance and the use of that in the market. Can you share, any of you have any insight on physical testing to validate that there's biogenic content, so like radiocarbon testing or carbon-14? And the use of that in the European market?
I can comment on that. So under the European regulations, there are requirements for carbon testing on co-processing of biogenic feedstocks, but they have exclusions for processes where the inputs are biomethane, because you don't have a biogenic signature to the carbon. So it's excluded from the process. And I think that they've kind of got that infrastructure in place. If you take a if you take a molecule that is derived from biomethane, you won't have to do the carbon tracing downstream, but you will have to still fulfill all the mass balancing requirements that you would otherwise have to do. Anybody else, Patrick, on that?
Yeah. When fraud became an obvious problem, the regulators looked at testing whether it was on the raw materials or the biofuels, whether physical testing was a better indicator of the sustainability attributes, and found that on some raw materials it was possible to differentiate between different oil seeds or fats, or oils and fats. But because mass balancing permits mixtures of those fats and oils, or even the finished fuels to happen, you lose that ability to differentiate between one origin or another. And so we're still back to the square one, where mass balancing and reporting through a chain of custody is the way to verify those. And it gets worse when you've got finished fuels. So it's very common for all those finished fuels, whether it's biodiesel, renewable diesel, HVO, ethanol, once they're mixed, the value of physical testing is gone.
And there have been and are trade barriers where they use C14 testing as a barrier to entry of foreign biofuels, particularly co-processed fuels. The European framework is very oriented towards trade, and there's been court cases which have made those C14 tests, rendered those C14 tests illegal. So they're trying to take down these trade barriers and really rely on the integrity of the mass balance systems. Well, that's any final words. Anybody else want to pitch anything in?
I would just say that it's a hugely complex market to be in. When I started, we were importing Brazilian sugarcane ethanol to the UK, and with a couple of changes of legislation in Europe and California, that switched to exporting Brazilian to California and importing US corn ethanol to Europe. And with the companies that we work with today, I think the most important thing to them is that they have prepared compliance to be able to access any one of those markets. So they have compliance optionality. Your physical processes are always going to be the same. You'll grow crops, you'll make biofuel. That story will always be the same. The compliance regime that you want to sell under is just asking you to present that information and that supply chain story in a different format, whether that's a life cycle calculation or auditing or certification. It's just a transfer of a story to an end consumer. So yeah, I think ideally we could move towards standardized certification systems to give people easy optionality, but more complex optionality is the current status.
Yeah, and I think as a final closing message, I think people should realize that optionality is often value, and that you should think of the option of getting ISCC certification for your projects as being value added, even if you're not using it today. If you have any future use, it could create value for you. So thank you, everybody, and thank you. I think we're the last session of the conference, so thank you very much for showing up, and we really appreciate your attendance.
Thank you.